Okay, so welcome back. We're discussing four myths about how architecture can actually manage the risks that are presented as a result of AI's intrusion into our life and our practice. The most common thing I hear is that to whatever extent AI creates efficiencies in practice, we'll manage by filling up our surplus time with more and more design. Architects are already particularly attracted to tools like DALL-E and Midjourney because they speed up the process of imagining and visualizing designs and create some really cool stuff. So there's this widespread belief that AI's effects of less time and less effort will result in more design, kind of like so. We'll just expand our design time. There's a couple of reasons why this is wrong, but before we get to them, let's make our best Steelman argument for the more and more design proposition. Most senior architects will be familiar with the McLeamy curve. The curve posits that an architect's ability to influence project direction declines as a project progresses, while the cost of design alterations increases. This makes a little bit of sense, right? So if you're in the first week of schematic designs, you can double the size of a building and it doesn't cost you anything, right? But once you get towards later stages of design, and especially into construction, all those design changes cost a lot. Therefore, architects should strive to have heavier involvement in earlier parts of the design cycle. So if this was the historic design cycle, then this is where McLeamy thought that we should be in some sort of integrated project delivery. That has always made a certain amount of sense to me, but I don't think it's going to save us entirely from the AI problem, and I don't think it's going to play out quite the way architects think it is. I see three main problems with the more and more design proposition.
The first error, I think, is the idea that AI will enable more and more design based on the assumption that AI will be deployed in areas where we want it to be, and that we can exclude its influence from the tasks which we would like to continue doing or do more of. Technology has never actually worked that way. Expanding our work in the earlier phases of the design cycle would require that there's more work to do there, which would in turn require that AI's effects of less time and less effort completely pass over these project phases. To me, this seems unrealistic. I don't know why technology writ large would obey our imperatives about where its effects should practically be felt. The second error is a little lengthy, so bear with me, but I think it's a failure to mind the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns is a fundamental principle of both macro and microeconomics, and while we don't typically think of creativity as an input in a production process, if you think about it, it kind of is, right? If in our wildest dreams the time and the fees for schematic design were doubled or tripled or quadrupled, would that result in designs that are 2x or 3x or 4x better? Let's try and do a simple exercise. We're going to assume a very simple commercial development project with around 150,000 square feet of leasable space at a rental price of about $5 per square foot, monthly entry costs we're pegging at about 15 cents per square foot per month, and construction costs at $400 per square foot. That's going to require a $60 million loan, and we'll assume 2.5% interest. Based on that, the developer doing this project is losing about $237,000 a month every month until the building opens. That is the loan payment based on those loan conditions. We've assumed here a 24-month process for pre-design, design, and construction. Might be a little bit fast, but it'll make the math relatively easy. Now, let's not feel sorry for this developer. Based on this math, they'll be netting about $524,000 per month every month after the building opens. Assuming a 30-year useful life of the building, you're looking at a net present value of just under $40 million. So it sounds like a pretty lucrative project. For those curious in doing this net present value analysis, I use a 10% discount rate if you'd like to recreate the results. Now we're going to assume a 5% improvement in the limited design outcomes that we've postulated. This is not whether the design is better according to us, this is whether the design is better according to a developer. So a 5% improvement in leasable square footage, a 5% increase in rentable price. We're also going to assume a corresponding increase in construction and energy cost under the assumption that more square footage means more construction materials and more energy costs due to light, that additional space, and whatnot. Is that always true? Perhaps not. Perhaps a big part of the design improvements is just identifying cost savings. However, we'll assume that no one wants to double the length of schematic design only to value engineer out 5% of the project. We can perform a similar net present value analysis for new improved design, which has benefited from a doubling of the schematic design period. Even accounting for increased costs, the project is more valuable because the architect has added leasable square footage to the project, and on top of that, has made the space better and more desirable, allowing the developer to charge a higher price. This is a frustration that I know many architects share. Even with only a 5% increase in design outcomes, or at least the design outcomes relevant to a real estate developer, the architect is able to generate an additional value of $2.25 million, and they only get paid for $200,000 of that increased value. So this extra 3-month schematic design period, this doubling of the schematic design period, yeah, we earned double our fee, right? But the real estate developer picked up, 1,000% return on that particular investment. This should make a good argument for just letting architects do their thing, but there's a flip side problem. Here are the same equations, but in this case assuming a 2.5% increase in design outcomes. It's the same drill: leasable square footage, rental price, construction costs, they've all gone up by 2.5%. Now the difference between the improved scenario and the original scenario is only $220,000, or basically the same amount that the developer paid the architect for all that extra design time. So the developer's wasted 3 months and basically doesn't get any net benefit out of that doubling of the schematic design period. We could do this whole day. We'll remember to discount any enhanced profits because of the extra 200 grand that the developer paid us for all that extra design time. But we've already done 5%, so we know it gets the developer a benefit of 2.25 million or a 5% overall improvement in the net present value of the project. And we've also done 2.5%, which we know doesn't create any additional value for the developer. Now we can also do this for 0% improvement. If all of our extra design time fails to result in any kind of improvements that matter to the developer and the profitability, the extra design time actually costs the developer an extra $2 million. That's a huge loss, equivalent to 5% of the entire project value. Obviously that loss isn't attributable to the 200 grand extra fees paid to the architect. It's mostly the effect of compounding interest as a result of the 3-month delay. But there's another flip side, and that's part of what makes this a trap. Let's imagine that we were able to get 50% design improvements. That would generate an extra $47 million for the developer, equivalent to a 120% improvement in the overall value of a project. So you double our design time, we'll double your profits. That would make a great slogan for architecture and for architects generally. In fact, the value of additional design improvement scales rapidly, resulting in more and more value to the project. But here's where the trap comes in. You took a 3-month schematic design contract, and by the standards of your profession and your own professional ethics, you produced a good one. I'm sure you did. Then you were given an additional 3 months to do more design under the auspices that more design makes things better. The thing is, if you're able to double the amount of leasable square footage on a project using the same site and program with that extra 3 months, it kind of implies that you didn't do a very good job in the first place. Now, I'm sure you did, so let's assume that you did a good job, and that your final design after the first 3 months is 95% of perfect. I know these things don't lend themselves easily to quantification, but let's pretend that your design is 95% as good as some hypothetical perfect project. And on top of that, you're given an extra 3 months to get that extra 5% and earn that extra $2.25 million for the developer. You talked about it with the client, they're like, yeah, I'll kill 3 months for $2.25 million, so go for it. The first thing to understand is that those results won't scale linearly. The closer to perfect something is, the closer to optimal something is, the harder it is to make improvements on it. So we can expect that the rate of improvement might be going down incrementally or asymptotically like so. I know, it still feels a little silly to put numbers on these sorts of things, but the basic idea is that the rate at which you can improve the design is declining the closer and closer you get to something perfect and optimal. Now, if that's true, then it means that your design is getting closer and closer to perfection in the same way, in the same proportion, eventually resulting in a hypothetical optimal project, at least by the developer's definitions of what would constitute an optimal. Like we did earlier, it's possible to chart the increased value to the project brought about by these improvements. So a 5% improvement from 95 to 100 is going to result in that $2.25 million payday for the developer, just like so. But it rises asymptotically, just like our improvements to the actual design, because the increased value to the developer is actually based on that. Now, there's a couple important things to remember about this. First is that the first 2.5% of the improvements are negative. It's not that they're not good, it's not that the architect is making good changes to the program, it's just that the value of those improvements doesn't outweigh the excess interest costs associated with the project's delay. So it takes until after 2.5 weeks, in this example, not generally, please don't quote me on that, in this example, for any of this extra design effort to even break even. The next couple of weeks are very interesting, because in these weeks, the value of design improvements is scaling rapidly like we saw before. By week 5.5, you're around $2 million of benefit flowing to the contractor as a result of all this extra design time. But then the progress starts to slow, because your design is inching closer and closer to real estate perfection, however you want to define that term. So in this example, there's kind of a sweet spot. For this example only, it occurs somewhere after 2.5 weeks, because that's a negative valuation, and up to about 5.5 weeks, because that's where you're getting most of the value. And then after that, any design improvements are adding value, at least on paper, but it's marginal when measured against the time involved. Since developers tend to be an impatient bunch, this would probably be of little interest to a client. Again, these numbers are completely arbitrary, but let's bring it back to our original example. As it turns out, doubling the amount of schematic design time doesn't do very much. By week 5 or 6, we've already captured most of the value that we're going to get, because our design was already pretty good in the first place. Now, if you did a super shitty design, and your design was, 50% of what might be considered like the best design, then you've got a lot of room to run. But here, there's no room for a 50% improvement on design projects because we did a good job with the first design. 6 weeks seems enough to capture most of the value associated with design improvements, or essentially a 50% increase in the amount of design time, from 3 months to 4.5 months. How does that fit into our discussion of AI? We began with this idea that all of this tech development would allow us to expand our design time, but the degree to which we're allowed to do that will depend on the additional value that we create. So it'll probably look more like this, honestly. Yeah, that's it. The amount of time savings generated by AI can't be filled up with design beyond the degree to which that additional design creates value. Using the example we just worked through, if it validates an additional 6 weeks on a 3-month project, that's a 50% expansion of design time, but it's worth it because we pick up $2.25 million. Anything more than that, and it probably won't create perceived value for the client, and therefore no one is going to pay us to do it. If you make the case that all this extra design time is going to lead to better and better design outcomes indefinitely, it mostly just speaks to how substandard your initial submission was in the first place. Or at least that's how it's going to be perceived by the client, is my guess. The final idea, just to put a nail in the coffin of this whole, we're going to get to do more and more design thing, is an idea that I've always called the creativity surplus. Meaning every architect I know is already at a creativity surplus. They're more creative than their projects, clients, budgets, and principals will allow. I'm sure we've all seen a cartoon like this at some point. Just about every architect, starts off with the most creative vision, and that gets whittled down over the course of a project. Architects in the entire project cycle typically end up leaving a lot of creativity on the table, tragically so. I don't think it's their fault. I think collectively as a profession we haven't really made the case for why all these ideas that come out should be valued and should be prioritized, but that's a topic for another lecture. The final point is just this, right? If you're already working at a creativity surplus and you can't get someone to pay you for the creativity that you have, why would you expect someone to pay you for more of it? So the idea that AI is going to automate away all of the kind of drudgery of being an architect, like CDs and door schedules, and give us more time to explore our creative process and do more design, like who pays for that? The client's not going to pay for that. At least it doesn't seem like they will, because there's diminishing returns. There's already a surplus of creativity in the design of the built environment for the most part. It doesn't look good.
So here's another thing that won't work. Taking on more and more projects. It's a pretty intuitive solution. If we have 3 projects running on top of one another, which is how we've historically done our work, then when we compress the design phase, we get these kind of really skinny design phases. And, we'll just fill up the gaps with additional projects, right? So we'll put in a green project, and then we're going to put in a yellow project, and, this is what firm principals have always done. We just have to go out, and we have to hustle, and we've had to find additional work to keep folks busy during these kinds of lulls. However, it doesn't necessarily play out that way. When you cleave apart the design and construction parts of the cycle, and there's nothing in the middle, you can keep adding more and more projects, and the effects of that asymmetry become amplified. Noted, there would be an exception at much higher levels of project density. So if you stack 20 or 50 or 100 projects on top of each other, the variations in staffing from month to month would start to seem relatively small in relation to the overall staffing. However, assuming that you don't want to be managing 50 projects at the same time, the real problem here is the oblong project cycle. As AI intrudes onto architectural practice, it's going to affect the design cycle and the construction cycle, but differently, both in terms of their staffing and their overall compression, invariably leading to some kind of gap in between. Adding more projects means adding more gaps and amplifying the effects through time. So another semi-intuitive solution might be to reorient the design phase so that it's just closer to construction in order to eliminate the mentioned gaps. I'm calling this just-in-time architecture after just-in-time manufacturing. If you don't know what that is, look it up. But basically, once AI compresses this design cycle, we just move it forward so that it immediately precedes construction. This is probably the best of the scenarios we've seen so far, but we'll always see a similar problem in what we saw in the previous example. The exaggerated height of the design cycle reproduces itself over time, leading to ever-escalating staff requirements on the one side or wonky staffing levels on the other side. So, our fourth solution, and probably the most complicated, accelerated construction. So looking at a diagram like this, you might think, hey, rather than trying all this kind of wonky scheduling stuff, we're just going to move all the construction projects forward. And there's a couple reasons that doesn't work either, right? So as we stack up these projects, we run into a familiar problem where we've got this very asymmetrical workload between design and construction. And, you might leap at several solutions to that. One would be just spreading out the staffing on our projects, like we always do, like we always have. But if you get 4 overlapping jobs and then allocate staffing in the most even way possible in order to accommodate both the fixed construction cycle and the compressed design cycle, here's the problem. Highlighted in red are just the phases from the first project, and they've been spread out to accommodate this gap that we're trying to resolve. And one has to ask the obvious, why would any client tolerate this? I don't know any clients who are so generous that they would merely sit there and say, hey, the CDs are done, alright, just leave it alone. We'll start construction in 4 months whenever you're ready, and give you the time to work on your other projects for your other clients. That doesn't seem particularly realistic. People want buildings built, they want to build as fast as possible, while still doing them well. Clients want constructions to start as soon as the drawings are finished, especially when you're paying $200 grand a month in interest payments. And if you're dragging the project out so you can work on some other clients' projects, it smells like a lawsuit to me. Call me crazy. So the larger problem with the building cycle is the building cycle itself. The building cycle is its own thing. We designers are very accustomed to the idea that construction is something that follows design, and that is certainly true. But it doesn't drive design. It is the precursor. It's not the driver. These design projects are preceded by something as well, usually by some kind of land deal. There's some process by which a land is being made ready physically and legally for whatever is happening next. Prior to that is a financial process of securing money to execute whatever the project is going to be. And prior to that is the overall money supply, which is the most complicated of all. Now, what I've illustrated here is T1 to T2, T3, it doesn't matter. They can be quarters, they can be years. The point is that there's a different amount of money flowing into the built environment at different intervals of time. It's not constant, and you can't control it. Maybe the chair of the Federal Reserve can. But these are the factors that actually start to drive construction, and they're responsible for all the boom and bust cycles that we all know so well. So in this phase, we have 2 design projects because in the second row of this diagram, there was a flush of money, and it allowed the financing and the land deals to go through rather quickly. Moving forward into this band, we're surviving off of CA fees that were negotiated on contracts during sunnier times. And every firm has been through that I know of, where you're just kind of coasting along on the tail end of some CA contracts until the economy comes back or you score some new work. And maybe the last one is just kind of like what a normal design cycle looks like. So this demand for buildings, in turn, drives the demand for design services. What drives the demand for buildings? All these things. Inflation, population growth, industry changes, etc., etc. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list. These things drive the demand for buildings, and along with the supply of money, those are the things that allow the demand for design services. They allow buildings to happen. How exactly these work together, that's like a whole economics class, but fundamentally, architects' creativity and productivity do not have a relationship to any of these factors. The introduction of a technological advance to any market doesn't induce an increase in market demand. In all likelihood, AI will have very little effect on the demand for buildings, because that's going to be principally driven by the money supply, interest rates, population, etc. Therefore, it's not going to have much of an effect on the demand for design services. In the future, people will need buildings at whatever rate they need buildings. That may go up or it may go down, but will not go up or down based on whether an architect's productivity is increased. So, reviewing those 4 ideas in total, maybe it's just me, but it doesn't seem like any of these ideas are going to work. We can't really alter the building cycle, and yet we're chained to it by the nature of our profession. We can't really solve the problem by taking on more projects, because that just leads for work either stacking up or inconsistent staffing levels. In part 3, we're going to talk about solutions, and I think there's definitely a solution to this. There's definitely a way to accommodate all of AI's potential effects, and do so while creating more design time, influence, greater fees, and all the rest. But frankly, I think it's really going to require divorcing some of our historical practice models and rethinking how we do what we do and why.